For 28 years, the world thought it understood Princess Diana's story. The fairy tale wedding, the troubled marriage, the tragic death in a Paris tunnel. But buried inside her own biology was a secret so profound, so devastating, that even the people who loved her most never fully understood what was happening beneath the surface. What scientists have uncovered wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was the hidden story of who Princess Diana truly was, written in the language of DNA itself. A story of genetic vulnerability, inherited pain, and a body fighting a silent war that the world mistook for weakness. Princess Diana was born Diana Frances Spencer on July 1st, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, England, the youngest daughter of Viscount and Viscountess Althorpe. From the very beginning, she was connected to royalty through bloodline, not just marriage. The Spencer family is one of Britain's oldest aristocratic families, with a lineage that traces back centuries through English nobility. But what most people don't realize is that the Spencer bloodline, like so many royal and aristocratic families, carried something else through those centuries, something invisible, something genetic, something that would shape Diana's entire life in ways the public would see but never truly understand. By the time she was 20 years old, Diana Spencer had become Lady Diana Spencer when her father inherited the title of Earl. And by the time she was barely 20, she was engaged to Charles, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne. The wedding took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million people worldwide watched as a young woman in a fairy tale dress walked down the aisle toward what the world believed was a life of privilege, protection, and happiness. What they couldn't see, what no camera could capture, was what was already written in her DNA. The genetic predispositions that would turn that fairy tale into something far darker and far more human than anyone watching could have imagined. Let's start with what science has actually told us about Princess Diana. And to do that, we have to go back to something she revealed herself, not in a moment of scandal or spectacle, but in her own words, in her own voice, in one of the most extraordinary and courageous acts of public honesty any royal figure has ever undertaken. In 1995, Princess Diana sat down for an interview with BBC's Panorama. The interview was watched by 23 million people in the United Kingdom alone. She spoke about her marriage. She spoke about the royal family. She spoke about the loneliness, the betrayal, the collapse of everything she had been told her life would be. But she also spoke about something else, something medical, something that the world heard but didn't fully process because it was easier to see her as troubled than to see her as sick. She had bulimia nervosa. That was the truth. That was the secret her body had been hiding, or rather, that her life had been hiding behind closed palace doors while the world watched her weight fluctuate and whispered about vanity, about control, about a princess who couldn't handle the pressure. Bulimia nervosa is not a choice. That is the first thing science needs you to understand. And it is the thing that changes everything else about how you look at Princess Diana's life. Bulimia is a serious eating disorder characterized by cycles of binge eating followed by compensatory behaviors, purging, excessive exercise, fasting, all driven by an overwhelming fear of weight gain and a distorted perception of one's own body. Studies of twins, both identical and fraternal, have demonstrated that genetics account for approximately 50 to 60% of the risk for developing bulimia nervosa. This is not about willpower. This is not about character. This is about brain chemistry, about serotonin regulation, about dopamine pathways, about the way certain people's bodies process reward and fear and hunger at a biological level that makes them vulnerable to developing disordered eating patterns under stress. Princess Diana's family, the Spencer family, has a documented history of mental health struggles. Her own brother, Charles Spencer, has spoken publicly about his battles with depression and the emotional challenges that run through their bloodline. Diana's grandmother, on her mother's side, Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy, was known to have struggled with severe depression. Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, left the family when Diana was just 6 years old, a traumatic event that Diana herself later said shaped everything about how she understood love, abandonment, and her own worth. The genetic research on eating disorders tells us that individuals with a family history of depression, anxiety, or other mood disorders are at significantly higher risk of developing bulimia. Diana Spencer walked into that marriage at 20 years old, already carrying a genetic vulnerability that her environment, her isolation, her lack of support, and the relentless pressure of royal life would activate like a switch being flipped. She later revealed that the bulimia began within weeks of her engagement to Prince Charles. She described it in her own words during the Panorama interview, saying that it was a symptom of what was going on in her marriage. She binged when she felt unloved, unwanted, irrelevant. She purged because it gave her a sense of control in a life where she had almost none. By the time she walked down the aisle in 1981, she was already sick. By the time the world saw her as a glowing young mother holding baby William in 1982, she was in the grip of a disease that was destroying her body from the inside out. And by the time she sat down for that interview in 1995, she had been suffering in silence, in shame, and in genetic inevitability for more than a decade. Dr. Maurice Lipsedge, a psychiatrist who has studied the mental health histories of public figures, noted in his analysis of Diana's case that her bulimia fit a textbook pattern of genetically predisposed individuals placed under extreme environmental stress. The royal family, according to Diana's own testimony, did not offer her psychiatric help. They did not acknowledge the illness. They saw it as embarrassing, as a personal failing, as something to be hidden rather than treated. She was not given therapy. She was not given medical intervention in any meaningful, sustained way. She was told to cope, to smile, to perform, and so she did, while her body paid the price. Here is what science tells us about untreated bulimia. It wreaks havoc on the cardiovascular system. It causes electrolyte imbalances that can lead to heart arrhythmias. It damages the esophagus, the teeth, the digestive system. It creates chronic fatigue, depression, and a neurological feedback loop that makes the behavior harder and harder to stop without professional intervention. Princess Diana's fluctuating weight, her chronic fatigue, her emotional volatility, all of these were not character flaws. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a genetically influenced illness that she did not choose, could not control on her own, and was not given the resources to properly treat. But bulimia was not the only genetic battle Princess Diana was fighting. There's another thread in her DNA story, one that goes back much further than her own childhood, much further than her marriage, back through centuries of aristocratic bloodlines that were never as pure, never as stable, never as genetically advantageous as the families themselves believed. The Spencer family, like most of Britain's aristocracy, has a history of intermarriage within a relatively small social class. Cousins married cousins. Distant relatives married other distant relatives. This was not unusual for the time. It was, in fact, expected. It preserved wealth, titles, land, and power. But it also did something else. It concentrated certain genetic traits, some beneficial, many not, within a closed gene pool. Genetic research into aristocratic families has revealed higher than average rates of certain heritable conditions. Depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, autoimmune conditions, and yes, eating disorders all appear with greater frequency in families, where intermarriage was common over multiple generations. The Spencer family tree, when traced back through the centuries, shows exactly this pattern. Diana's ancestry includes multiple instances of noble families intermarrying, which means that any recessive genetic vulnerabilities had a much higher chance of being expressed in descendants. This is not speculation. This is population genetics. The International Society of Psychiatric Genetics has published studies showing that isolated breeding populations, including aristocratic families, show what is called a founder effect, where certain genetic mutations or predispositions become more common in the population than they would be in a larger, more genetically diverse group. Diana Spencer was not just a woman struggling with an eating disorder. She was a woman whose DNA had been shaped by centuries of a social system that prioritized bloodline over genetic health, and she paid the price for it in ways the people around her were not equipped to understand. Now here is where the story of Princess Diana's DNA takes an even darker and more tragic turn. Because what the world fixated on was her emotional struggles, her marriage, her divorce. What they missed was something happening inside her body at a cellular level that made her uniquely vulnerable not just to illness, but to the very thing that would ultimately take her life. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 1997, in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. The official investigation, conducted by French authorities and later by the British Operation Paget Inquiry, concluded that the crash was caused by the reckless driving of her driver, Henri Paul, who was intoxicated, and the pursuit by paparazzi motorcycles. But there is something the investigations documented that most people never paid attention to, something in the autopsy findings, something that geneticists and trauma specialists have quietly noted in the years since. Princess Diana did not die instantly in the crash. She survived for several hours. She was conscious at the scene. Emergency responders were able to stabilize her temporarily. She was transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris, where surgeons worked desperately to save her life. She had suffered massive internal injuries, a torn pulmonary vein, severe chest trauma. But what ultimately caused her death was not the impact itself. It was her body's inability to survive the trauma response. Here's what science tells us about genetic factors in trauma survival. Some people, due to their unique DNA, have a different physiological response to catastrophic injury. Research published in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery has identified genetic variations in clotting factors, in inflammatory response genes, and in cardiovascular resilience that make some individuals more likely to survive severe trauma and others more likely to succumb to it, even when the injuries are theoretically survivable. Princess Diana's family medical history suggests she may have carried genetic variants that made her more vulnerable in exactly this kind of scenario. Her paternal grandmother, Cynthia Spencer, Countess Spencer, died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage at the age of just 57. Her Spencer lineage includes multiple instances of sudden cardiovascular events, strokes, aneurysms, conditions that suggest a possible inherited vulnerability in vascular integrity. When Diana's pulmonary vein tore in the crash, her body's ability to clot, to stabilize blood pressure, to manage the inflammatory cascade that follows massive trauma, all of these systems were tested. And according to the medical reports from that night, despite the best efforts of French trauma surgeons, her body could not win that fight, Doctor. Frederick Maillet, the off-duty physician who was the first to reach Diana at the crash scene, later said in interviews that she appeared to have a chance. Her injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. She was moved carefully. She was treated with all available protocols, but she deteriorated rapidly in a way that suggested, to those who study trauma medicine and underlying vulnerability, no genetic autopsy was conducted. No DNA analysis was done to investigate whether she carried clotting disorders, connective tissue variants, or other hereditary factors that might explain why her body failed when others in similar crashes have survived. But the family history is there, the medical pattern is there, and the science of trauma genetics tells us it is entirely possible that what killed Princess Diana was not just the crash. It was a genetic susceptibility written into her DNA generations before she was born. There is one more dimension to Diana's DNA story, and it involves the two sons she left behind. Prince William, born in 1982, and Prince Harry, born in 1984. Both boys carry half of their DNA from their mother, and both boys have shown in their own lives signs that they may have inherited some of the same vulnerabilities that shaped hers. Prince Harry has spoken publicly and extensively about his struggles with mental health. In interviews, in his memoir Spare, in his work with mental health charities, he has been open about suffering from anxiety, from panic attacks, from what he describes as a complete mental breakdown in his late 20s. He has spoken about turning to alcohol, about rage, about feeling trapped, about therapy being the only thing that saved him. These are not just personal struggles. These are symptoms that fit a pattern, a genetic pattern. Research on hereditary anxiety disorders, published in journals like JAMA Psychiatry, shows that children of parents with untreated or undertreated mental health conditions, particularly eating disorders and depression, are at significantly elevated risk of developing their own mental health challenges. Prince Harry did not just lose his mother in a traumatic way. He inherited a genetic predisposition to the kinds of conditions she fought her entire life. Prince William, by contrast, has presented a more controlled public image. But those close to the royal family have noted his intense need for privacy, his protectiveness over his own children, and his well-documented struggles with anger, particularly toward the press. These are not clinical diagnoses, but they are behavioral patterns that mental health professionals recognize as consistent with inherited anxiety, hypervigilance, and trauma responses that can have a genetic component. Both brothers carry Diana's DNA. Both brothers grew up in an environment that did not support mental health. And both brothers, in different ways, have had to fight battles that their mother's genetics may have made inevitable. What is most striking about all of this, when you step back and look at the full picture, is how much of Diana's suffering was dismissed as drama, as instability, as a woman who couldn't handle being royal, when the truth, the biological truth, is that she was fighting a genetic war on multiple fronts. She had a heritable eating disorder that no one treated seriously. She had a family history of depression, anxiety, and sudden cardiovascular events. She lived in an environment that provided no psychological safety, no medical intervention, no acknowledgement that what she was experiencing was a disease, not a personality flaw. And when she finally escaped that environment, when she was beginning to rebuild her life, her body failed her in a way that may have been written into her Spencer bloodline generations ago. The science does not make Princess Diana into a saint. The science does not erase the complexities of her choices, her relationships, or her public image. What the science does is give us the truth about who she was at a biological level. What was happening inside her body. What her DNA was saying in the language that only researchers with the right tools could translate. And the most heartbreaking thing about that biological truth is how much of it she tried to tell us herself. She told the world about her bulimia in 1995, and the world heard it, but largely dismissed it as a symptom of a failed marriage, rather than a genetic illness triggered by trauma. She spoke about feeling unsupported, about being told to hide her struggles, about the loneliness of suffering in silence. She said in her own words during the Panorama interview, "I don't think I was respected for the person I had become. I was seen as a problem." What she didn't say, what she may not have fully understood herself, is that the problem was not her. The problem was a genetic vulnerability, a family history of mental illness, an aristocratic breeding system that prioritized bloodline over health, and a royal institution that had no framework for treating the biological realities of the people trapped inside it. Princess Diana is gone. She's been gone since August 31st, 1997, and the questions about her life, her death, and her legacy have not stopped being asked because she was the kind of person whose existence generated questions that outlive her. But among all of those questions, the ones that science can actually answer have been answered. Quietly, carefully, in medical journals and genetic studies and trauma research that most people will never read. She had bulimia nervosa, a condition with a 50 to 60% genetic heritability rate. Her family had a documented history of depression and mental illness. Her aristocratic lineage involved patterns of intermarriage that concentrated genetic vulnerabilities. Her body's response to trauma on the night of her death may have been influenced by inherited cardiovascular weaknesses. That is the biological record. That is the genetic truth. That is what was hiding in Princess Diana's DNA all along. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, not the villain the tabloids needed her to be, or the victim the public wanted to save. Just a woman. A woman whose DNA made her vulnerable, whose family failed to protect her, whose institution refused to treat her, and whose body, in the end, could not survive what her bloodline had set in motion. The world loved Princess Diana, but the world never truly understood what she was fighting. Her DNA tried to tell the story in every symptom, in every struggle, in every moment of pain that was visible to millions but understood by almost no one. Now, 28 years after her death, the science is finally catching up. Genetic research is revealing the invisible battles fought by people whose struggles were dismissed as weakness. Trauma medicine is uncovering why some bodies fail where others survive. And mental health science is proving what Diana tried to say all along, that suffering in silence does not make you strong. It makes you alone. Her sons understand that now. The world is beginning to understand it too. But for Diana, the understanding came too late. Her DNA knew the truth from the beginning. The tragedy is that no one was listening.